Nietzsche's will to power was the beginning of postmodern philosophy. Nietzsche understood the values and attitudes of the civilized man with greater clarity par excellence. He succeeded where all before him failed. In his suitably titled work, Genealogy of Morality, he devised a method of philosophical investigation so laden with interpretive capability it would expose the mendaciousness of 2 millennia of Western history. Nietzsche had alluded to the genealogical project previously, but never had set it before an audience with such academic rigor and clarity as in Genealogy of Morality. The genealogical method, the genealogy as he called it, was both explanatory, but with predictive power too. And with this, it portended a sweeping philosophical movement at the turn of the 20th century, one that he would later be vindicated by. Nietzsche is many things to many people. A rudimentary glance of his text might construe him as an ideologue, or at least ideologically sympathetic, whether congenial to communists, capitalists, liberals, fascists, or other ideological groups. Frankly, you could list them out endlessly. Many schools have summoned, and will continue to summon, the authority of his name in defense of their ideas. Nietzsche was a very well-read gent and familiar with both historical and contemporary political affairs, but he took to painstaking measure to circumvent these superficial discourses. He never allowed his ideas to settle. We should prefer with this an artistic reading of him. The program he professed would outmaneuver the trappings of conviction. He writes in The Antichrist, "Men of convictions are prisoners." This, however, has done little to assuage the recurring and many clumsy attempts of his inheritors to interpret into his principles a predominant ideological package. Some say he's the darling of far-right fascism, caught up in the German jingoism of Richard Wagner, while others read him yet with a revolutionary strain, someone who is seeking to promote an anti-capitalist message. Trying to fit Nietzsche into any of these categories is misplaced. The most voracious framework scholars have deployed to understand his ideas might closely mirror a psychological aristocratic radicalism. As a Danish critic once wrote in a pamphlet, Nietzsche later confirmed. But even tarring him with the brush of a political theory does injustice to the intellectual complexity of his project. So no positive program of Nietzsche's is required to then relate his ideas to later left-wing politics of power, what I mean here being postmodernism. It is because of this that I can detach myself from any politically charged conversation about Nietzsche and instead look only to his historical and philosophical reception. Nietzsche asserts that interpretation lies at the heart of all philosophical inquiry, and that our epistemological faculties fall short of enabling any essential or absolute truth to be realized. Nietzsche was, as such, skeptical of man's capacity for capital T, truth. Many of the great philosophers up until his writing had, in certain terms, bore a congenital defect. Each had extrapolated from the local conditions of their life to project a universal picture of reality. From their particular lot, this universal came to force, but philosophy's defect was patent. Any attempt to produce an ontology could only ever begin in human observation or thought. All contingent human ideas emerge from the various necessities, in a reverse Hegelian sense, of our local existence. This borrows from Schopenhauer's sufficient reason, according to which anything that appears as an object of knowledge does so only in relation to a knowing subject. The world as representation only exists insofar as something that can be known has also its knower. Under these conditions, the relationship of object and subject can be suspended, but within this necessity lies the biases that shroud judgment. Despite the Enlightenment's best efforts, neither reason nor empiricism were found to escape human provenance. Thus, standing atop a flawed foundation, All truths remained forever human truths, and indelibly so. Nietzsche saw the Socratic a fixation on truth and its pursuit as a fault in the philosophical scheme. It was Socrates who sought to shatter manifold idolatry in truth's service. In doing so, Socrates capitulated to the falsest idol of them all, truth itself. Successive philosophers who followed Athens more or less failed to revise this Socratic impulse latent in philosophy. Truth remained forever the object of philosophy, a ceaseless labour to build systems that might better, and hopefully more completely, explain reality. Each philosopher believed themselves to have outdone their predecessor, yet to Nietzsche the deceit was plain to see. All systems reflected local planes of the human imagination. Philosophy was no more than a tool for basic biases to be repackaged, then dressed in terms sympathetic to the academic world. That was Nietzsche's purpose, to metamorphose philosophy. He wanted philosophy to find rhythm with the human heart, an artistic, no longer intellectual pursuit. In Human All Too Human, he writes, the most glorious colours are extracted from base, even despised substances. He continues in the next aphorism, quote, but the philosopher sees instincts in present-day man and assumes they belong to the unchangeable facts of human nature, that they can, to that extent, provide a key to the understanding of the world in general. This entire teleology is predicated on the ability to speak about man of the last 4,000 years as if he were eternal, the natural direction of all things in the world from the beginning. Skeptics had long recognized truth as predicated upon faith, whether in God or some static, rational, universal law. Yet all philosophers, even self-proclaimed atheists, had merely shuffled the deck of Western metaphysics, then dispensed with the discipline entirely. Nietzsche continued to prosecute the value of truth. Truth is a woman and loves only a warrior. He found the dogmatic hangover of truth and the belief in a true world still at license in varied Western perspectives. First Platonic, then Christian, Kantian, and at last positivist. In different forms it lingered like a shadow cast behind man, his ball and chain. Even the mistress of pessimism, Schopenhauer, had rested his philosophical outlook on a Kantian system, rather than one of bona fide atheism, a capitulation to the idea, but shrouded in mist and skepticism. As the true world appeared before Nietzsche as a fable, the question did come to him. Is man merely a mistake of God's, or God merely a mistake of man? He inverts the traditional question of theism. If God had created man, the creation was of stupefying folly. Man, as object, disposed by God into a forsaken landscape haunted by the wolfman, where he would clamber in the ruins of meaning. There the suffering, confusion, and ceaseless conflict would await him. Every perspective faced, alien, dim, and unaccommodating to his lot. If, in Nietzsche's preferred construction, man had created God, then God was designed to deliver the healing balm of illusion, a tonic fit for human consumption, or, in Nietzsche's estimation, unfit for human consumption, to redeem the soul from the terror of night. Man needed God lest the all-consuming fear and confusion of the true world crush him. Traditional Christian metaphysics held the true world as discernible through revelation. Later apologists, like Descartes, believed metaphysical convictions were knowable through reason. Descartes was significant within the Enlightenment project. His idol was the ascendancy of the mind to divine the position of an eternal world that sense and appearance could not get at. His project to demonstrate God's existence in a world unconvinced by revelation was constructed to protect Western metaphysics through rationality. This faith in the rational ego consciousness emerged as perhaps the high watermark of philosophical conceit. As another metaphysician, Kant viewed reality as plumbed by an unreachable truth. The true world could be apprehended through empiricism and reason, at least to the point where man has knowledge of its existence, but never intimately known. Rather, what Nietzsche saw was a world that's human-dependent, an infinitude of perspectives, each confounded by affect and bias. To Nietzsche, there is not a true reality, nor a fixed, unmoving permanence somehow discoverable. The vicissitudes of life are so confounding, any faculty for truth discovery is rendered defunct. The search for the Kantian noumena, or true world, was a doomed project to begin with. Its conviction failed to recognize the perspectival nature of man and his condemnation to the world of sensory perception. Nietzsche's method to truth search was permeated with the verity of interpretation. He thus brings forward the claim that everything is fluid, ungraspable, elusive. The most lasting things are just our opinions, and as such, even the most fundamental and basic ontological elements of existence are not beyond the remit of human interpretation. He applied the interpretive principle most of all to the discipline he trained in, philology. In its time, philology was a leading area at the frontier of contemporary science. It was the study of ancient and classical texts, particularly the Judean Bible. Nietzsche, however, specialized in Latin and Greek poetry. Philologists scrutinized the writings of long-deceased theorists to weigh the linguistic, cultural, and historical context from which they emerged. The discipline aimed to achieve deep and authoritative accounts of texts, but did not limit the interpretation to the text to its natural and ordinary meaning alone. Broader context and purpose, too, were also considered. Even after Nietzsche had left the academy and fled to the mountains of Switzerland and Italy, his training in philology continued to animate the philosophical ideas that he proposed. He later tarnished the discipline altogether, perhaps not out of an academic conviction, but for personal reasons. Its methods, however, clearly remained the wellspring for which his thoughts would continue to flow. And in order to clarify how interpretation could be measured, Nietzsche attempts to devise the closest approximation he can to an intelligible principle by which human nature, or even the world itself, is oriented. And where does he land? Power. Leading scientists and philosophers during Nietzsche's time were concerned with the question of the true nature of the world. Metaphysics was a legitimate form of inquiry, and continental philosophers had already exhausted centuries to amass a body of texts conjecturing on the universe's organization, all of which the analytical school would come to challenge. Aware of both fields, Nietzsche finds a way to transcend the discourse altogether. The faith continental philosophers placed in themselves to intuit a systematic metaphysics was misplaced. For each route theories beset with logical fallacies, and failed to yield absolutes. Conversely, he also repudiated the rise of analytical philosophy, and the idea of a Darwinian self-preserving gene. To Nietzsche, other tendencies that superseded this gene could be readily identified. The positivist framework of the 20th century saw belief in fixed reality, mappable through language and mathematical equations, the most offensive suggestion of all to Nietzsche. He saw several ideas in the existing discourse that, once recast as his own, could offer greater explanatory value. Schopenhauer's ontological will and framework to atomize the material world of subject-object to a singular, ceaseless, and eternal metaphysical principle was deeply influential. While embracing much of Schopenhauer in his early productive life, he would come to reject the principle of the will and metaphysics, but not all elements of Schopenhauer's will could be so quickly discarded. To be sure, Nietzsche saw possibility in the extraction of a quasi-idea of will from Schopenhauer's system. The vigorous insights of Schopenhauer served the marble for which Nietzsche chiseled the will to power. At first he was gripped by the revelatory value of the will to power as a psychological construct. Humans were not concerned with self-preservation, nor with the drive to utility. What animated the thoughts and ambitions of human behavior was a drive to overcome oneself, the feeling of self-mastery and excellence. but he extended this to encompass the world writ large. The will to power is not a will to accrue power, as understood in social convention, nor even the feeling of expansion. As was conceived in the zeitgeist at the time, it is far from the feeling of awe felt in the handsome Prussian faces who rallied against French troops in the 19th century, as his deeply proto-Nazi sister, Frau Foster Nietzsche, pressed. Rather, the will to power is ongoing, and it's a process of overcoming. He writes, "A living thing wants above all to discharge its force. Preservation is only a consequence of this." The Will to Power 650. So with this, Nietzsche had refashioned Schopenhauer and interpreted into human affairs the principle of power, the world as reducible to power and its manifold transactions. Like Schopenhauer, he formulates the secret of becoming as a sort of will to power in itself. Reality, therefore, is a collision of such wills. This was to prove not only a philosophical revelation, but one of immense academic value. Now scholars had a clear framework through which the scientific discipline could be scrutinized. If all science is the product of humans, and humans are creatures that give to passion, then these achievements are constructed on faulty and non-essential foundations. Humans are motivated, as is science. If modernism is defined as a belief in a rationalist, positivist world where knowledge can be acquired and settled, then postmodernism is a point beyond this modernist architecture, where all truth claims are subject to question, revision, and reinterpretation. Quote, "What, therefore, is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which, poetically and rhetorically, intensified, metamorphosed, adorned, and after long usage seems to a nation fixed, canonic and binding. Truths are illusions of which one has forgotten that they are illusions, worn-out metaphors which have become powerless to affect the senses, coins which have their obverse effaced and are now no longer of account as coins, but merely as metal." Unquote. And that's taken from Non-Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, published in 1873. The hermeneutic Nietzsche is found here, applying his genealogical method to historical documents and science. Even the most rigorous scientific practice cannot overcome the fated limits of human authorship. The anthropological doubling, where man is both the object and subject of study, are organized patterns of grunting and wood markings to postulate theories more aptly reflect the limitations of human faculty than the possibility of producing absolutes from a hypothetical vacuum, free from subject perception. The collision of wills would remain. Even the most profound natural scientists are subjects of passion. As such, power pervades the world of these structures, and the convention itself is reducible to this exchange. Nietzsche disassembled the house of cards that comprise the predominant belief in reason or trust in empiricism, exposing the threadbare and fatigable relationship between man and truth. Jacques Deleuze, a French postmodernist, explored a simple but queer phrase Nietzsche had scratched onto his notes one day. "I have forgotten my umbrella," was all that it read. The statement seemed simple enough, but Deleuze pondered. Its triviality could conceivably mask a deeper, esoteric meaning. He first considered, "Everyone knows that I have forgotten my umbrella means, I have an umbrella, it is mine, but I forgot it." But upon reflection, perhaps Nietzsche hadn't meant that at all. What if he'd been trying to remember a joke? What if this was a crude metaphor? Its real meaning is trivial to the larger point, the inherent deficiencies of the truth or meaning-gathering process. The only medium by which meaning is exchanged, language, is indelibly corrupted by the natural world. With no other world behind or within the natural world, we're left with the mere absurd. We can never know what Nietzsche actually meant with the phrase, which is the whole idea. This challenge or search had been embraced by the postmodernists, whose struggle with meaning was their calling. Nietzsche is not an ontological relativist, however, who renders science and meaning gathering as a futile endeavour. We are justified in scientific pursuit and the falsification of the world through the legislation of language, as he called it, or what Wittgenstein loosely considered linguistic games. This is the Apollinian construction of forms and categories in an undivided and absurd Dionysian world. In science, we make these nominal designations to develop medicine, identify threats, as it has served us biologically, but more than anything to expand human enterprise, to better encompass the world. Our Socratic truth impulse has an adaptive advantage. That Nietzsche recognized at the very edge of this world, we might be tempted to reject modernism outright and commit Nietzsche to postmodernism. Nietzsche, to be sure, does not make ontological postmodernist convictions. Rather, he develops a genealogical method to question and probe. This Apollinian form-bringing nature of Nietzsche was a predominant feature of the postmodernists. Ideas are not intrinsically evident but permeated with extrinsic value and constructed by human hands. The vivisection of ideas is a fruitful endeavour. This approach was utilized by later postmodernists like Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, and Neymas, and members of the Frankfurt School. The French postmodernist darling, Michel Foucault, had emphatically and confidently declared himself Nietzschean, though we would do well to scrutinize this claim. Foucault lauded Nietzsche for his epistemological theory and for identifying a chasm that lay unperceived at the center of philosophy. Nietzsche, to Foucault, had successfully teased out the relationship between the subject and the object. That is, this anthropological doubling where the human is both the object of study, so what is being studied, as well as the subject, the studier. Beset with evident flaws this process had been, Foucault understood the ingenuity of this finding. Nietzsche, as a trained philologer, had merged philology and its emphasis on hermeneutics with the study of philosophy more broadly. As Foucault explicates, he had been the first to connect the philosophical task with a radical reflection upon language. Nietzsche achieved a revision of analytical structuralism and the strict but misplaced alignment of knowledge and language to empirical reality. At any rate, the Foucaultian Nietzsche did not tell the complete picture. Nietzsche was not a postmodernism, for he avoided ontological claims, which was a deliberate intellectual strategy so he might participate in commentary on morality and art. He did this all without being a relativist as well. Postmodernism is beset with further dissimilarities to Nietzsche, most particularly of all is the political realm, being pluralism and moralization. Nietzsche was more right-wing in his politics than the postmodernists, much more so, but he influenced their philosophy altogether. Many of the postmodernists, like Foucault, would pronounce Nietzsche holy. They read him as a devout believer of their secular, postmodernist cult, but Nietzsche had never written of a settled idea, at least not intentionally. Were his writing ever to settle, sooner would it lose its allure. He writes, "My written and painted thoughts, you have already taken off your novelty, and some of you, I fear, are on the point of becoming truths." The oxymoron to both laud Homeric values as based on his genealogy, but reject authoritative truth, is pieced together in his ruinous artistic project. Further, the ethical system Nietzsche proposed, particularly as part of his genealogy, is far from a postmodern vision. The restoration of antique virtues inherent to Homeric societies would come at the expense of any postmodern or relativistic state. Nietzsche never loses himself in the chaos and oxymoron. As a reader, however, you can often find the ground beneath you shake and the air tighten. Nietzsche's oxymoron is almost to the point of irony, but that's precisely his goal. He's not perturbed in the slightest by the chaotic or the ambiguous. We find him as a philosopher of the dark and terrible Dionysus. the duality between modernism and postmodernism, rationality and irrationality. Nietzsche's bold ideas did not shatter conventional wisdom, rather he shook its foundation and used a tuning fork to sound out the idols of Western metaphysics, finding there a hollow sound. Nietzsche decided then he would leave in his wake the sapling of postmodernism. Nietzsche a great favourite. No better should I continue than let him instead. He writes, "Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history, but nevertheless it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he would still not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. There were eternities during which it did not exist, and when it is all over with the human intellect, nothing will have happened."